right, first I wanted to thank Rob and Tara for inviting me to your home to speak to you about my experiences. My salvation comes from grace and faith in Jesus Christ alone. It's not about me anymore, it's all about Him. My mom's family was LDS, and we can trace our heritage back to the wagon trains that came across the country to Utah. They settled in the Utah Valley, and I have a lot of history in the Utah Valley. My grandparents, on my mom's side, were both LDS, and my mom was born into the covenant and raised LDS. My dad was a convert, and he became LDS shortly after his dad died, right around the same time he graduated from high school. But I was born into the covenant, and I was raised LDS. And I left, when I was about 10 years old, my parents got divorced, and my dad says that he was excommunicated. At the time, there was no such thing as resignation, so I think he asked to be excommunicated. And he just fell away from the church. But growing up, they were very active. They had several callings. My dad especially liked working with the scouts, and he was always in the scouting group. So when my parents got divorced, my dad was still very supportive of us going to church when we went to go visit him during the summers and at Christmas time. He was always willing to take us to church. He wouldn't go, but he was willing to take my brothers and sisters and I to church. And I just clung to the LDS Church at that point. And I wanted to be righteous. I wanted to follow all the rules perfectly. And I wanted to do everything just right. I wanted to obey the word of wisdom. My track was to go to the temple, to marry in the temple. That was my goal, and that was my focus. And I thought I was doing pretty good until I started to date when I was 16. And I didn't really date LDS guys for some reason. But I didn't, and I got pregnant when I was 17. And the day I got pregnant, I had a temple worthiness interview. And looking back, probably should have canceled it, but I didn't. So the bishop was going through the questions, let me back up. As a teenager, I was going to the temple. I was doing baptisms for the dead. I held several callings. I was a young women's class president various times, was secretary, had a lot of callings, and I knew all the right answers to the Mormon Church. Looking back, I probably knew even more than what a lot of people knew. I had read Gospel Doctrine several times. My mom had a copy, and I knew a lot of the faults, but I still just believed it. It was okay about the polygamy. It was okay about different obscure doctrines. I was okay with that. It's just I belong to the true church. So back to my temple interview. The questions, do you sustain the current prophet? Why, yes, I do. Do you sustain the local church leaders? Yeah, I sure do. Do you obey the word of wisdom? Of course I do. I don't drink coffee, I don't drink tea, I don't drink Coke, I don't drink Dr. Pepper, I don't drink Diet Coke, Diet Dr. Pepper. I don't drink caffeine-free Coke. I obeyed everything to a T. Do I obey my parents? Sure. Do you tell the truth? Are you honest? Absolutely, 100% honest. Do you obey the law of chastity? What do you mean by that? Being 100% honest. He said jokingly, well, you aren't having sex, are you? And I said, well, I don't really feel comfortable telling you that. And his eyes got really wide, And he said, well, you aren't pregnant, are you? 100% telling the truth. Well, yes, I am. And he was a family friend. I had grown up with him. He was my bishop, you know. But on the other hand, he was a guy. I don't think that's it's appropriate to ask those kinds of questions looking back. But I was honest with him, and I told him that I was pregnant. The next thing he asked, have you told your mom? Well, I had just found out that day, probably a couple hours earlier. And I said, no. And he really pressured me, you know, you need to tell your mom, this is really important. I said, you know what, it's my business, and I'll tell her when I'm ready. And I waited a couple days and told her that I was pregnant. So the bishop talked to me again, and he decided that I would be disfellowshipped. Just to give a little bit of information, disfellowshipped is not as severe as excommunication. I can still go to church. I could still pay tithing, but I couldn't hold any. I couldn't hold any callings. And I couldn't take the sacrament, and I was fine with that. I didn't really understand sin like I do now. I felt like I had sinned against God. I was fine with that. But I didn't sin against the Mormon Church. I didn't sin against my parents. I didn't sin against my church leaders. But there was still a lot of this guilt that I had toward those people. And I really didn't know what I was supposed to do about that sin that I had. Catholics, they can do Hail Marys or whatever. I just didn't feel like, what could I do? I felt sorry that I got pregnant and that I was having sex out of wedlock, but I didn't feel sorry for having my son. You know, I didn't feel guilty about him being a part of my life. So I was very confused about how I would go about fixing what I had done. So it was a real struggle for me. And I was fine to be disfellowshipped. It was okay. I didn't harbor any resentment or any hard feelings toward being disfellowshipped. It was the proper right thing to do. But I just didn't know how to make it right again. You know, the bishop would ask me, you know, do you feel sorry for what you did? I'm like, yeah, definitely, of course, you know. I mean, why wouldn't I feel sorry for what I had done? But how was I going to fix that? How was I going to get back on that path where I needed to be? And I really just was not sure. My bishop asked if he would meet, if he could meet with my son's dad, and I don't think he ever did. My son's dad was a professed Christian, but I don't think he was born again. And I'm thankful at the time for that, because it would have been really difficult, I think. So I had my son, and a couple months later, I moved to Michigan, and I lived with my aunt and uncle, who are strong LDS, and they now teach at BYU. And I lived with them for almost a year, and during that time, I broke up with my son's dad. But because I had my son when I was 17, almost 18, I didn't have a very good transition into Relief Society. It was very awkward because they kind of wanted me in Relief Society, but I wasn't old enough to be with the old ladies. And it was very awkward in Idaho. And then when I moved to Michigan, it was still very awkward, even though I really didn't know anybody. So they decided, my aunt was teaching in young women, so they decided, well, we'll just have her help out the young women. Although I think they were a little bit nervous that I would corrupt their youth, but it was okay. So I was still disfellowshipped in Michigan. So after about a year, I moved back and lived with my mom. At the time, we were living in Idaho. And I got back, and at some point I was re-fellowshipped back in. Not really sure how I convinced them that I was, again, worthy. I don't really know. And I still don't know what I was expected to do to be good again, to be righteous and to be worthy again. It was very awkward. And so during that time, I think my bishop and I decided that it would probably be good if I went to a young adult ward, which was fine with me. So I was going to Boise State University at the time, and I joined a singles ward. And I was walking down the hall at church, and, I'm carrying my son, or maybe I was holding his hand. Anyway, so I'm walking down the halls at church, and I saw somebody I knew in high school. And as they came up to me, they whispered something that wasn't very nice. And looking back, I'm just so grateful they did that. Because I don't remember who it was. And I remember what they said, but I don't remember who it was. I don't remember anything about it except for, this is how God still feels about me. And so I left, and I never went back, ever. I was done. I didn't want to be LDS. I didn't want to have anything to do with religion. If God couldn't forgive me for what I had done, even though I had been punished for a year, then I was done. And I became agnostic. And I really didn't care about God. I didn't care if there was a God. I was just done. I didn't want to have anything to do with rules. I didn't want to have anything to do with hypocrisy. I knew plenty of people that had done the same sins that I had done and got away with it. And done worse sins and got away with it. And I wasn't necessarily comparing myself to them. I was just saying, what am I supposed to do? So I became agnostic. And several years went by, and I started working. I started working at a company, and I had some really good, supportive Christian friends who prayed for me constantly, and prayed and prayed. And they would invite me to things that their churches, and I would always decline. I had something else going on, or I just wasn't ready. And finally, I accepted an invitation. And I went, and I didn't expect it to be like Mormonism, but it was so uncomfortable. The songs were upbeat. They were all about Jesus. It was a women's fellowship, and I thought we were going to learn about canning. I was a little nervous about that. But it was about Jesus. And Jeanette Henry is the pastor's wife, and she spoke about, it was this short devotional, she spoke about always looking up to God, and I was like, I've heard this stuff 1,000 times. I wasn't really impressed. But then Dee Sarton, which is a local news anchor woman in Boise, got up and spoke. And she spoke about joy. And she said, her husband is a really great guy, but he doesn't bring her joy. As she was getting ready that night, she was getting dressed, and her husband mentioned something about how she didn't look all that great. She said, he doesn't bring me joy. And she has a couple kids, and she said they're great kids, but they don't bring her joy. Joy comes from God, and it comes from the peace that only God can give. It's not happiness. Happiness is different. Happiness is based on circumstance. But joy is a peace that you can feel when you know God. And my friend was sitting next to me, and she was really angry with God because she knew that I'm a happy, upbeat person, that that's just my personality. Obviously not tonight, but anyway, so she knew this about me. She was really, really angry at God. She's like, finally, she's praying to God. She says, I finally got Emily to come, and you're talking about something that she doesn't need. But God knew what I needed. And so God just worked and worked and worked on me during that whole time. And Jeanette got back up after Dee was done and said, you know, if you feel like you need to make a decision tonight for Jesus, do it. Don't wait. And so they were singing some songs, and I reached over to my friend, and I'm sure she's probably like, oh my gosh, she's completely shocked. And she turned to me and she said, Emily, what do you want? And I said, I want Jesus in my life. And they had women up front that would pray with people. And so there were a couple women that had gone up. And so I said, I want Jesus in my life. And she said, do you want to go up front? And I said, yeah. So she walked up with me. And there were a couple other friends that also had gone, those friends that had prayed for me. So we all went up front, and my friend Melissa was up there. And Melissa said, you know, what do you want? And I said, you know, I want Jesus in my life, but I don't know how to do that. She said, well, do you want to pray with me? And I'm like, yeah, definitely. So she prayed with me, and that separation that I had felt was my sin. It wasn't these sins that I had done, it was my sin. And I finally realized that's what the separation was. It wasn't somebody saying something bad in the hall. It was what I needed, and I needed a relationship with God, and I needed a relationship with Jesus, and I wanted him in my life. So I prayed and asked him to come into my life, and he did. And it was from that time forward, and in that instant, I knew Mormonism was wrong. It was dead wrong. And sometimes I know that God has forgiven me for how I was when I was Mormon, but sometimes I still just, it breaks my heart to think of how I was, how awfully blasphemous I was to God, and how I knew I had the resources, I had the Bible. You know, I should have opened the Bible and read what it said. I went to seminary growing up, and we went through the New Testament. And through the New Testament, we memorized 25 verses. And to me, the most important book in the Bible, obviously, you know, Jesus' life is so important. But second is Romans. Romans talks about grace, and it talks about this gift that we can be given. And there's one verse we memorized in seminary. One verse. It's Romans 1:16. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Of course, this means I'm not ashamed of the LDS Church. Everything was twisted. And I just think, why couldn't I have just opened my Bible and read? It was so easy to do. But I wasn't ready at the time. And I know that there are so many different ways to reach the LDS people. For me, it wasn't the doctrine. I was fine with the doctrine. Wasn't polygamy. I was fine with that. Wasn't Joseph Smith and his philandering, his seeking with the stones. It didn't bother me. What bothered me was that I lacked joy in my life. I lacked Jesus. And everybody lacks Jesus. And so there are so many different ways that we can reach the LDS people. As Rob mentioned, I go down to Temple Square and I talk to LDS people about Mormonism and about their beliefs. And some of my family members know that I go down. And they ask me, why in the world do you go down? They just don't get it. They don't understand, and that's okay. I don't have any family that's a Christian, so a lot of them just don't understand. But in Romans, like I said, it's my favorite book. Romans 9, verses 1 through 3. Just a second, I'm looking for it. Paul said that he spoke the truth in Christ, that he wasn't lying. His conscience confirms it through the Holy Spirit. I, meaning me, have great sorrow and unceasing anguish. I tell people it's so painful to me. It just kills me to know how blasphemous and how wrong Mormonism is. And I wish myself were cursed and cut off from Christ for the sake of my people. Because the LDS, they're my people. I grew up LDS. And I grew up in the culture, and I grew up knowing the beliefs. And those are my people. I have pain for my family, for my friends that don't know Jesus and are trying to earn their way to heaven. And they're defending the false teachings for their own pride, so they can become gods, so they can become righteous. And it's just so wrong. I feel great sorrow when I hear the blasphemy. I recently went to a funeral. I just cried the whole time. I just cried and cried and cried. I just couldn't hear it and not cry. Talking about being baptized, LDS, and the pressure that's put on them to be worthy and to go to the temple, and all of it, it's all for nothing. All my righteousness was filthy rags. All of it. It was all for nothing. It's all, it just says here, God, this is what I'm doing. You know, God says, well, you know, what about what I did on the cross? That's what I did for you. And that's what he did for me. So instead of trusting my works for my salvation, instead of the free gift Jesus gave, I gave it up. My testimony is a testimony of the power of God. I know that he has the power to save the lost and to save the most righteous LDS, because I was one of them. That's it.
Okay, guys, let's have some questions.
Yeah, can I just say something really fast? Normally, I am not a very emotional person. But when I talk about Jesus and what he did in my life, I can't help it. Every time I go to church after I was saved, I've been saved over 11 years now, and probably 4 or 5 years, I just sit and cry the whole service. And it was just God. It was just worshiping God. So normally I'm not emotional. If you saw me in the street, you didn't think I'd be very emotional, but I just get that way about Jesus. Can't help it. Okay, questions?
I have one.
Okay.
When did you get married, and
yeah.
was that before or after you
Yeah,
met Christ?
I was going to tell you, wasn't it? After I came back from Michigan, I met my husband, and we were married 3 months to the day after we met. And he was never Mormon, never LDS. His family's not LDS. And I've heard that sometimes people blame a spouse for leaving, but I had left at that point. I had probably left the week before. So, yeah, and he doesn't really understand the culture. He doesn't really understand the songs and the belief system. He really doesn't understand any of it, but yeah. My son, I was going to mention this part too. My son, my mom talked me into getting him blessed into the LDS Church. And she just said it's a blessing for a good life, it's harmless. And I realize now that he was actually a member of record. So he is a member of the church on record. So I didn't mention this either. I resigned from the LDS Church. Living in Idaho, it's just no big deal. There's so many people in Idaho. There's there's a lot of LDS people, but there's not a high pressure in Idaho. So I never resigned. A couple years ago we moved to Connecticut. It was definitely not a big deal there. I think there's one stake in Connecticut. And then when I moved here, realized that it is a cultural thing to be LDS, and people would ask me if I resigned, and I said no. And I found that to be honest and to be true, I need to resign. So I resigned this summer. So now I can tell people I am resigned. I was raised LDS and I'm gone now. I'm free.
So how did that process take place, and how long did it take, and what exactly?
The resignation?
Yeah.
When I resigned, found out I could do it through email from a friend, and submitted it. I did a read receipt so that I knew when they received it. They replied back and said, no problem. I received my letter within a couple days that it would be processed. And they said that they would wait 30 days, even though I waived the waiting period. I figured they would probably do the waiting period. 60 days later, I received my letter in the mail.
Did they send you the warning of your eternal consequences?
Yeah. Oh. Yeah. And it was awesome. It is eternal consequences.
I was like laughing, I'm like, and it's not a cult.
Yeah. When I left, I know that a lot of people get pressure from different, from ward members and things like that. Because I had transferred to the young adults ward, I couldn't even say I knew who my bishop was in the young adults ward. And so I left there, and I think my home ward just figured that I went to the young adults ward. And so I just kind of faded into oblivion, didn't get cookies, didn't get anything when I left.
Nice.
Praise God. I know, yeah. And I was fine with that. It was good because I didn't really want to have anything to do with God, and he knew that. So
So your mom didn't try and send them out after you?
maybe, I don't know. I don't think so.
My mom said that with my sisters and me.
Yeah.
Not me anymore, but like
Yeah.
all of a sudden the bishop shows up at my door and I'm like, I got my mom's call.
No bishop visits, no Relief Society visits, nothing.
Where's your
at all.
son now?
My oldest, he's 20 years old, and he lives at home still. And when I resigned, I put him on the letter, but they didn't respond to it. So he's
Is he
not
LDS?
LDS. No, he's not LDS. And I talk to my kids a lot about Mormonism and a lot about the culture and the beliefs, and they're just like, what? I'm like, I know, it's okay. I know, it's so, and they just cannot understand sometimes. I'm like, well, they have special underwear, and I'm trying to describe, and they're like, what? I mean, looking back, they're just so confused about the whole thing. My kids go and they've worked for my LDS grandpa and my uncles in California over the summer, and they take them to church, and they just come home with all kinds of questions, never wanting to be LDS, of course, but just like, they talked about 3 levels of heaven. I'm like, well, we can talk about where that came from in the Bible. And I'll read to you what it says. And I'll read to you the LDS headings and how when you read the LDS headings in the Bible, it gets put into your head, oh, you know, there must be 3 kingdoms, because that's where it talks about 3 kingdoms. And, you know, so when I read through it, they're like, I don't get it. And I'm like, I know. I'm sorry. I can't help you with that. It's just, you know, now I look at it and go, what was I thinking? What, you know. Yeah.
That one movie, what is it, the one, lifting the veil on polygamy, and the lady at the end says, thank God I have a son who doesn't know who Joseph Smith is.
Yeah, the veil of polygamy, and she picked him up and twirled him around. I mean, sometimes you feel that way when I talk to my kids and they just don't know anything about Joseph Smith and don't know anything about Madsen. I'm like, let me clue you in, you know, so they understand it, but yeah, they just don't get it. They're like,
Is there anything to be known about Madsen? I mean,
no.
Joseph Smith is at least interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
When you were a Mormon, did you ever feel like all the rules and regulations were attainable? That you could ever really achieve what the goals were?
Yeah, a little bit. I think, you know, I was righteous. I mean, I was doing good. You know, I read the Book of Mormon on a regular basis. I was going to seminary. I mean, the list doesn't seem too daunting, you know, as long as you're on this right path.
You was getting patted on the back a lot.
Yeah. What I didn't understand were the laws that Jesus talks about. If you're angry, that's equivalent to murder. Well, you know, of course I didn't murder anybody, you know, but when you think about being angry, when you think about those higher laws that Jesus set out, that wasn't my standard. My standard was the word of wisdom. It was doing baptisms for the dead whenever I could. It was this Mormon track, so I felt fine about it, you know, till I fell off the wagon, got pregnant. I mean, it was so bizarre. It was like, you know, class president, you know, 2 weeks later and pregnant. It was a quick, you know, and I mean, praise God that I went through that. I mean, who knows where I would be now? God uses the things that we need to become saved. He doesn't use those things like my friend. She's like, why in the world are you talking about joy? She didn't know that's what I needed. I mean, he just knows us so well and knows what it takes. And, you know, I didn't really hear things about the impossible gospel, and, you know, looking back, I didn't really think about the ramifications of what I learned, families are forever and becoming a God. I really didn't think about all that stuff. There were answers to everything. I mean, you could go look up apologists and they would just have answers and I would just take them. So, yeah, it's not sad. Yeah.
Given your experience in the hallway at the Single Ward, how would you respond to Mormons who say you only left because you got offended?
Yeah, that's kind of hard because I did. So I just admit it, but really, I mean, you have to think a little bit deeper than that. And it really wasn't that person. Don't remember who they were. I knew them at the time. Don't remember who they were. I didn't hold anything against them. And really, I turned all that toward God, and it was more my sin. I mean, I had sin. You know, I couldn't hide it. And so I just say, you know, I was offended. But, you know, God changed me. I have a lot of LDS family, and they say, you know, we've been praying for you, and you'll come back. And I think, you know, a caterpillar is content being on a leaf, and it's content just eating the leaves. And when it changes from a caterpillar to a butterfly, it has this freedom, and it spreads its wings. Would it go back to being a caterpillar? Would it go back to the confines that he has and the life that he had before? I'm a new creature. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't go back. Butterflies don't go back to being caterpillars. They just don't. I just couldn't do that. And it's hard to explain it to people. It's hard to explain how God has changed me in miraculous ways.
But that is a great illustration.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're great at that.
He just changes us. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about your lovely bracelets?
Yeah. I went to Manti for the first time this year. And it's awesome not going as an LDS person as you flock in. I went outside and I engaged in conversations with LDS. And this was to distinguish the Christians from the LDS people, because we kept going up to the Christians saying, can we have a conversation? My bracelet says Sola Fide, and it means by faith alone. And that's really it. By faith alone am I saved, not by any of my works. What could I do? Here's my being class president. And God's like, right. Here's my going to the temple and doing baptisms for the dead. And God's like, I don't want that. I want you. I want all of you. So now he's got it. Let God.
So I have a question.
Yeah.
What about your husband? Does he Christian?
My husband professes to be a Christian. He started going to church with me in January. So, yeah.
What church you guys going to?
We go to South Mountain Community Church, which is in Draper. It's just a little bit from our house. And we have a pastor that talks about Jesus. He doesn't talk about, going to the temple and being baptized. He talks about Jesus. And we sing songs just about Jesus, not about following the prophet, not about praise to the man. He isn't worthy of my praise. Jesus is worthy of my praise. So all those songs that I thought were bizarre, I'm singing to him now. I know them all. Listen to KTSY and driving to and from work, I'm praising Jesus the whole way to work and the whole way home. It's just the joy that God has given me. I shouldn't listen to KTSY because I start crying sometimes. That's dangerous on the freeway, but I can't help it. What Jesus has done for me, what he's done in my life, how he's transformed me. Sometimes I'm just still amazed. He's awesome. He's worthy of my praise. He is. Yeah.
Did you get baptized?
Did I? Yeah, that's kind of a funny story. I started to go to church, and I don't know what it is, but I kind of, no one ever talked to me about baptism, and I was kind of content not being baptized. I was kind of, it wasn't that I was thinking that the Mormon baptism was valid. I certainly didn't think it was valid, but I don't know. I just didn't get baptized right away. And when I became a Christian, I decided that I wanted to understand the Bible as a small child. So the first thing that I did was I bought a child's Bible because I wanted to read the stories as a child. The second thing I did is I taught 3- and 4-year-old Sunday school class, which was a blast. And I taught for a while, and the pastor's wife came up to me one day and she says, Emily, we have a rule here at our church that in order to serve in our church, you need to be a member. And I said, okay, that's fine. You know, I want to be a member. I've been going here for a number of years. And she said, and a rule to be a member is you have to have a profession of Christ. And I said, done it, got it. And you have to be baptized. Oh, well, I probably should do that then, huh? And I didn't have a problem with it because I had professed Christ. And I had learned that baptism isn't a part of sanctification. It's just a symbolic buried with Christ and risen with Christ. And so after learning more and more about baptism, I'm like, yeah, I should be baptized. Well, to make things a little bit less awkward, my pastor had been baptized as a small child, but at the time he had just did it. It wasn't a profession of faith. It was more like a small kid pressure thing. So he was baptized that day, and his pastor that he grew up with was also baptized that day. So I was in good company, and I was baptized in the Boise River on a beautiful day, and it was awesome. You know, it was awesome professing my faith in Christ. There were some people overlooking where we were baptized, and as each person was baptized, and they were having like a garden party, but as each person was baptized, they were clapping and stuff. It was awesome. That's good. So, yeah, I've been baptized a while.
So when was it?
What?
When was it?
It was probably 2 years after I was saved. Maybe 2001, 2002. I was saved in 2000. So, yeah, a little bit after that. I felt so embarrassed. I'm like, you know, now I've got to tell somebody that I was, you know, that I haven't been baptized and I slipped through the cracks. But, you know, it was more my pride, I guess, that got in the way. But it was a great experience. It was really, really great. Yeah. And that's, you know, it's so different. I've been to LDS baptism since I went to my niece's baptism, and it's so clinical. Mm-hmm. You know, it's so, yeah, and still, you know, there's some, well, you go down and you do your thing and you come up, and if you do it wrong, you do it again. It's just like, it's the prescribed way that you do it, you know, and there's some things that I still have a hard time with. One of them is authority. And I have a hard time, like, who's gonna baptize me? And I'm like, you know, trying to decide who's gonna baptize me. And we just decided my pastor would baptize me, but I mean, we don't need authority to baptize. Our authority comes from God. We don't need something that's been passed down from, you know, John the Baptist. It's just, you know, now it's just foolishness, all of it. I went and passed out tracts in a neighborhood in Draper. And, you know, I'm like, as we're driving up there, I'm like, you know, this will be so awesome. And then I'm like, who's giving me the authority to do this? I haven't really talked to my pastor about doing this. I'm like, you know what? Jesus gives me the authority. I have the authority in his name to speak in his name and to, you know, talk to people about Jesus in his name. It's just so bizarre sometimes. I'm like, you know, who do I have to get authority from? Mm-hmm. God. It's just, so that's one thing that I still have an issue with is authority, but apparently I'm getting over it, right? So, yeah. Yeah.
How did you get involved in the Temple Square evangelism?
Good question. Well, you know, I knew a lot of people and their famous names. After I was saved, I joined an online ministry for Mormons in transition, and it's sponsored by the Institute for Religious Research. And so I had been a part of this group for quite a number of years. And so we had had a lot of discussions about people in Utah and things like that. And I started to become friends with a lot of the people that were doing evangelism here on Facebook. And so it was a good way to connect with a lot of people. And then I saw one day that there was a post for a chat, and it was a chat group with LDS and evangelicals, and so I'm like, hey, I want to go see this. I want to be a part of it, and it was a video chat, and so I started to meet the evangelicals that were on the chat group, and then so I met Russ Bales, and through that, you know, he's like, I think somebody, maybe Rob, maybe Russ, I don't know. Anyway, somebody invited me down to Temple Square. No, somebody said I'm going down to Temple Square. I'm like, I want to do that. So I just started going down, and I tell people, this is kind of a bad joke, but I tell people that I go down to the temple to do work for the dead.
Really good.
People that aren't LDS, they don't get that.
They're like, what?
But I just go down and I talk to people one-on-one about why they're LDS, about, you know, what they're doing. And a lot of people, I ask them, why are you still LDS? Well, I prayed about it. And the first thing I say is that biblical? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's not biblical. You don't pray about something to know whether it's true or not. And so I just, I have a real heart to go down there and to talk to them. And I have a sister that talked to me, and I would call her on the way home, not trying to upset her or anything, you know. So what are you doing tonight? Well, you don't want to know where I was. Yeah, I do. Where were you? I was at the temple. Why do you waste your time going down there? And I say, what better time do I have than to go down and talk to people about Jesus? Mm-hmm. What more is more, you know, what's more important? What more do I have to do than to do that? And sometimes I feel like the time I was saved up until this year, which is when I started going down, and God, what a waste of time. What a waste of time that I did, you know, being a Christian and not talking to people about Jesus. Sometimes I beat myself up and say, God, you know, I should have been doing this all along. Because I know what they went through. I know how they live. I know their beliefs, and I can talk to people and, you know, just share Jesus with them. So.
Did you ask your sister why she wastes her time with you?
No, but I could.
I mean, or maybe you
She
could
just
put
doesn't-
it more as a challenge, you know, why aren't you going to the temple more often?
Yeah. She's inactive.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, I have two older brothers that just never really believed at all. And I have two younger sisters. One is pretty active still, and one who's pretty inactive, but she's not a Christian. And so, you know, I just use different opportunities to talk to her about the Bible. And, you know, we get into different discussions, but the Bible says that the cross is foolish to those that don't believe. Mm-hmm. And I just think they just don't understand because they don't know Jesus. If they knew Jesus, I mean, she'd be down, you know, helping me and saying, you know, what can I do? What can I say? How can I share Jesus with others? the Bible says, let your light so shine before men. And this is another thing I say to people down at the temple. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and people are like, huh? And I'm like, so you can go to heaven? And they're like, so you can get married in the temple? So you can become a god? No, it's so you can glorify God. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. And that's what I want to do. That's what I want to glorify God in everything that I do. And when I go down to the temple, it's all about God. It's not about me. It's not about my pride. It's about Him. And what can I say to people so that I can glorify God in everything I do.
So do you actually talk to them like inside the temple grounds? Or
No,
do you have to
we're
stand
not allowed
outside?
in.
That's what I'm wondering, yeah. But then what about like Main Street and stuff, you know how they have like, they own like, well, they own all of downtown, but you know like the Main Street area, you know, where, I mean, can you go down there? I mean, cause like when at Christmas time, anyone can go see the lights, how do they distinguish, oh, here comes a Christian, you know what I mean?
Well, I don't want to get too conspiracy theory, but they probably have our pictures on file, and but we stand just outside the temple. It was really funny. One night I was down there and I was passing out a DVD, and I said, "Would you like a DVD? It compares Jesus and Joseph Smith." And this guy was like, "No," and he kept walking. Oh, and I said it's from an evangelical Christian point of view. I always point that out. And he's like, "No," and kept walking. And then I could see him come back. And he goes, "I thought you were an LDS person giving me a DVD." And I said, "No, that's inside the temple." I said, and he was an evangelical Christian.
Oh, wow.
And he talked to me about, are we successful going down there? And, anytime I can talk to somebody, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, sometimes I've talked for an hour or more with one person. Anytime I can share Jesus with anybody, it's worthwhile. And, a lot of Christians are like, well, should you be down there? Is that the proper place? There's no other place to be. Why wouldn't I be down there? What other place is better than to go down? And there are LDS people down there, but there are also tourists down there that are Christians that want to know more about Mormonism. And so, I've gotten into some really, really good conversations. There's no better place to be to me.
So how long does it take them to realize what you're doing before they won't let you, you know what I mean?
Well, LDS people know right away that I'm a Christian and that I'm talking to them. Is that what you mean?
I mean, like, is it like the prophet or who comes and tells you, excuse me, you can't be handing out? I mean, it's like they have
outside
their little
the temple
security.
grounds.
Yeah, well,
Outside
I mean
the temple
like
grounds,
inside.
they don't.
I know they can't outside.
I've never been stopped in the temple grounds, but I don't do any talking really inside temple grounds. I've only been inside once, and then sometimes I cut through. But I've heard that some people, whenever they start to mention some of the stranger doctrines, they're escorted off.
Yeah.
I've never been escorted off. I'm too nice.
That's awesome. I just want to ask you a question.
Yeah.
I know that I feel this way, and lots of other ex-Mormons may feel this way, but I can witness to missionaries off the street. I am very, very uncomfortable going down to Temple Square for some reason. Have you ever experienced that? I did have an incident where I got kind of pushed around down there, so it makes me even more nervous to go down there. But did you experience that, or have you heard of other ex-Mormons that feel that same way, like just kind of nervous?
Definitely. And you know what? I feel nervous every time I go down. So don't get me wrong. It's not a basket of roses going down there. It's very, I sometimes get nervous going down, but. We bathe the area in prayer. We pray every time we go down and ask for good conversations and ask that God direct us into what we need to do. And that's one way in which I think that I've really grown in the past year is that is asking God more for his favor. You know, I'm here doing work for you. I'm here glorifying you. Please help me to glorify you in any way possible. And there have been instances where, you know, things start to get a little hostile down there, of course, because they're defending Mormonism. They're not defending Jesus, they're defending Mormonism in their church. We had one time a guy came up to us and he says, I work up in that building up there. And it was the church headquarters up there real high. Like, and do you want to know about Jesus? You know?
Do you notice like a heavy demonic presence? I know that's like how I feel and other people feel, and so that's why I'm very uncomfortable going there. It seems to be more noticeable there than anywhere else in the state for me personally. I don't know if you've noticed that at all too.
You know, and I've heard that a lot from a lot of people. But for me, there's a song on Christian radio and it says, you're the God of this city. And he's the God of these people. He is. And so when I call on his strength, I couldn't do it on my own. There's no way I could go there on my own. But relying on him, it gives me strength to talk to people about Jesus. And so it's a little creepy going inside temple grounds, but for me, I don't know how many of you have been to Las Vegas, but walking down the street, there's like a plant, and you're like, for reals, is that a real plant or is that fake? Like everything in Las Vegas, you can't really tell if it's fake or real. And that's kind of how I feel about Temple Square. It's like it looks all nice and pristine, but it's fake. It's none of it is to glorify God. None of it. You know, there's nobody saying we're building this for Jesus. We want people to recognize Jesus and to, you know, I mean, it's all about the LDS Church. Can I tell you about the missionary work that we're doing and the humanitarian work we're doing? And can I tell you about how many relief societies, whatever, how many wards, how many stakes? I mean, it's not about Jesus. And so, I mean, when I go through, sometimes I just hurry right through because I don't want to stay very long. I don't want to get kicked out either.
So do you ever get the little Mormon missionaries talking to you about?
Yeah, and I mean, I feel bad you brought that up. So
Sorry, I've been down there.
it's
a lot
okay.
too.
Some of you know this story. I went down there and I got there a little early, and so I decided to go. I had never been down to the temple, so I'm like, you know, I want to go down and just look around and to see what's there. So I'm going to the different statues and writing down my notes and my feelings about, you know, the priesthood and things like that. So I go to sit down and I'm taking notes, and this really nice gentleman comes up to me, and he's older and he starts talking to me, and I didn't want to reveal that I was ex-LDS. I wanted to get honest conversation. Not that I was trying to proselytize or anything like that, but I just wanted to talk to them. And I knew if I said anything, I would be kicked out. And I didn't want to lie, but I didn't want to be upfront about me being a Christian. Not me being a Christian, but me being ex-LDS. I did tell them that I was a Christian. Well, he calls over some sister missionaries. And I'm like, oh. And so they take me down into one of the visitor centers in the basement, and we're talking, and you know, they're getting all emotional about Jesus, or about, you know, Joseph Smith, and I'm like, this, you know, it was torture, you know, because it's just such blasphemy, and we talked about, you know, and I was kind of asking them leading questions. I asked them about, you know, why are you LDS, and you know, we're children of God, and I said, is that biblical? And they're like, yes, and I'm like, show me. because I know full well that it's not biblical, that we become children of Christ through adoption after we're saved. So I know this. So she showed me in the Bible where it says, see right here, children of God. And I said, well, let's read a couple verses higher, and let's read what it says. And I said, doesn't this say through adoption? Well, I guess it does. And I'm like, so isn't it through adoption that we become children of God? And yeah, I guess. Let's move right along. Let's not linger. So they were showing me videos and stuff like that, and I was telling them, I have to get going, and I told them that I was Christian. I made it very clear that I was Christian, and then I attended a Christian church in Draper. But so I left, and they were calling me, and anyway, so I was down in front of Temple Square, and one of the LDS missionaries that I had talked to came walking by, and I was talking to this lady, and she said, "You didn't tell me the whole truth about you." I'm like, and I felt bad because I probably should have mentioned more about my background, but I wanted their answers. I wanted to know their feelings, and I know that if I said I was ex-LDS, that's what the conversation would be about. So the next time I went down to Temple Square, I went and looked for her, and I looked and looked to try and talk to her, and I just wanted to tell her that I'm sorry that I deceived her, and that I should have been more honest, but explaining my intent that I wanted to talk to them about the LDS Church, but I couldn't ever find her. So, I mean, yeah, it gets a little awkward sometimes down there. But it's been very, very rewarding. It really has. When you see the lights go on and you see people coming out of that fog that's down there and the glassy eyes, and when you talk to them about really hard questions that they've never thought before. Why are you still LDS? Why do you still believe? And a lot of them, well, that's how I was raised. Is that good enough? I mean, this is your eternity. Is that good enough for you? And I prayed about it. Well, is that the right way that we discern truth, is through prayer?